Thank you, Gerard. And I welcome everybody back to our second half of Live Jesus. Our second presenter this morning hails from the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Born into a large family, Father Hushen is one of 8 children. He received his undergraduate degree from Penn State University. He then went on to receive 2 masters. The first, a Master's of Divinity from DeSales School of Theology, and the second, a Master's in Counseling from the Catholic University of America. Since being ordained a member of the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales in 1991, Father Hushen has served in numerous ministries, and we look forward to hearing about his life's journey in his talk with us today. He currently serves as the Chief Mission and Legacy Officer of Ashley Addiction Treatment in Havre de Grace, Maryland. Please join me in a warm OLGC welcome for Father Mark Hushen.
My name is Mark Hushen. I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means I've been abstinent from alcohol and drugs since October of 1988. As a result of that, I was able to complete my education, be ordained a priest in the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales, and regain the respect and love of my friends and my family. Shortly after ordination, I was assigned to Northeast Catholic High School for boys. One of the gentlemen sitting behind me leaned up and said, "North Catholic, huh?" Fablio. I knew he was a graduate. During my time there, I had the unique ability to draw the troubled boys in the school into my office. One day the principal walked by, he looked in, I had a whole crew of them. They were the boys who were at risk for alcohol and drug abuse, violence, crime in the city of Philadelphia. And I was able to advocate for them, find the ones who needed treatment, get them treatment, and then be there to support them when they returned. And after passing my office and looking in, the principal said to me, "Hushen, why do you have all the hoodlums of the school in your office all the time?" And I said, "Well, Father, that brings up a memory. My youngest sister went to Cardinal O'Hara High School, where I graduated from in Springfield, PA, and she's 8 years younger than I am. And when she went to O'Hara, she went in and she met one of her teachers, and the teacher said to her, 'Hushen, any relation to Mark?' She said, 'Yeah, he's my brother.' 'What's he doing with himself these days?' 'He's a Catholic priest.'" The teacher goes on to say, "When he was here, he was a hoodlum." Well, I was able to win the minds and the hearts of the boys at North Catholic. They became very loyal to me, so much so that one day I'm in my office and all the boys know where you park and what car you drive, and they came in and said to me, "Hey, Father, we recognize that right passenger hubcap on your car's missing. Want us to take care of that?" And I knew if I would have said yes, there would have been some other vehicle in the neighborhood missing a right passenger hubcap. So I said, "That's okay, boys. We have one on order." After North Catholic, I was stationed at St. Anthony of Padua, a large Italian-American parish in Wilmington, Delaware, and I eventually became pastor there. One of my favorite activities was to go and to visit the children in the elementary school, because when I went in, I was like the Pied Piper, and there would be like this electricity that would go around. He's here, he's here, he's here. So I visited the cafeteria one day, and this little guy, unbeknownst to me, is the focus of everybody's attention. He comes running up to me with his lunch bag and a pencil and says, "Father Mark, can I have your autograph?" Not thinking, I said, "Sure." I took his lunch bag and his pencil, and I leaned down and I wrote on his bag, and then all of a sudden, it set off a chain reaction. And all these kids are coming at me with placemats and napkins and bags. And the principal's looking at me like, what am I going to do with all this chaos? We also had a girls' academy at the parish, Padua Academy. And I had All Saints Mass on one occasion. And I was so fired up with the Spirit, I jumped off the stage. And I thought in my mind that the stage was only about 3 feet high. Well, the oblates who are here know that Padua Academy, the stage is about 6 feet high. So I got vestments going up in my face, and I'm like, I should be on the ground. And I landed like right in front of this young lady who's like, several years later, I saw her. She said to me, "You're the guy who did stage diving during our masses, aren't you?" I don't know if she remembered a word of the homily, but she was with me. After I was at St. Anthony of Padua, I got the call to move into the work that I'm doing now, drug and alcohol treatment. And I was hired at the Karen Foundation, a center, Karen Treatment Centers now, in Wernersville, Pennsylvania. And I arrived there, and things were going really well, and I was a few years into it. And this young woman comes to my office and says, "Can I speak with you?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "I'm seeking, but I'm kind of lost. You see, my father is Muslim, my mother is Christian, and I don't know who I am. Can I participate in Sunday Eucharist with the community?" And I was curious, and I said, "Well, could you tell me what your motivation is? Why you would like to do that?" And she says this to me: "Because I'm falling in love with Jesus Christ." By all means, you come and participate. Currently, I am the Mission and Legacy Officer at Ashley Addiction Treatment, which means that I am charged with the spiritual care and wellness of the staff, the patient community, and the mission and legacy of our co-founders, Father Joseph Martin of the famed Chalk Talks and May Abraham. I had the unique privilege of praying with Father Martin quite often. And on Sundays, I would go to visit with him because he was incapacitated at that time. And I would sit on a little bench at the feet of his easy chair, and we would talk, and he would kind of teach me, and we would pray, and then I would give him communion. And we talk about in our tradition the spiritual phases of development: the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. Father Martin was someone who, after a long series of events and a lifetime of commitment to the church and to God and to the recovering community, had achieved the unitive way. And the way I know that is when I would pray with him and give him communion, he would slip into an ecstatic state. And he was no longer with me. It was only Father Martin and God. And this profound sense of peace would wash over him and come right over top of me as I sat at his feet. And the silence in that peace was so profound, you could almost hear it. That might sound unusual, but the silence in that peace was so profound, you could hear it. And I would just sit and I would wait with him, and I know he would be back with me when all of a sudden he would smile and there'd be a little twinkle in his eye and he would continue the conversation. Just a couple years ago, a good friend of mine and I, we walked the Camino de Santiago, a 550-mile hike through northern Spain. Must be a supporter. Some of you may have seen the movie The Way with Martin Sheen. That's the journey that we went on, and it was life-transforming. So I share all of these stories with you because without sobriety, without 12-step recovery, without Salesian spirituality, none of it is possible. Getting sober or embarking on the spiritual journey requires change. And change isn't always easy for we human beings. And sometimes fear becomes a chief obstacle of change. Fear can paralyze us and immobilize us and prevent us from growing and evolving and changing. And so I think the theme for today, Be Not Afraid, is relevant to all of us because we are all on the journey. And change continues to happen even through death. So Francis de Sales gives us a great sentiment, quote, when it comes to change and to growing and to fear, when he says, "Do not fear what may happen tomorrow. The same loving Father who cares for you today will care for you tomorrow and every day. Either he will shield you from suffering, or he will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put all anxious thoughts and imaginings aside." Be not afraid. My title for today's talk is Train the Mind, Change the Brain. Change the brain, change the game. Say that with me one time. Train the mind, change the brain. Change the brain, change the game. Hopefully, by the time I'm finished, you will understand what that title means. So I always begin with a couple theological propositions. Right? One from Thomas Aquinas, one from Augustine, and one from Francis de Sales. We come from God, and our whole life is a journey back to God. And while we're on this journey, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And our hearts will consistently seek more until they find the love of God. Therefore, seek God everywhere. And if you do, you will find God everywhere. Because from my perspective, addiction is a misguided spiritual search. On this journey, we have a hunger, a longing, a spiritual ache to be connected, to be in love, to be intimately known and loved by God, and to love God in return. And addiction hijacks us off of that journey. And we begin to believe that some spirits might quench the thirst of the soul rather than the spirit. Spirits, alcohol, spirit. So with this hunger and thirst that we have, this longing, this ache, right, we can get duped into believing something other than the Spirit can feed that hunger, can quench that thirst. And if we go that route and get hijacked or get detoured, our souls know it because we feel restless, irritable, and discontented. When we are on the path home, on the path back to God, we have a chance of experiencing some joy, optimism, hope, freedom, and peace. But when the heart gets distracted, gets hijacked, gets addicted, we know restlessness, irritability, and discontent. I like to use an image that we have a God-positioning soul. We come from God, we're on a journey back to God. Our souls know when we're on the right road. A spiritual GPS, if you will. And when we get hijacked, and when we make a detour, and we go down the wrong road, it's as if our soul is saying what the early GPSs in our vehicles used to say. Recalculating. And so what do? As a person in recovery, we make a course correction. And that might be for a person in recovery going to a 12-step meeting. It might mean calling a sponsor. It might mean working a particular step in the 12 steps. It might be doing some service work. It might be doing some prayer, some meditation, some relaxation. In our lives as Catholics, that recalculation can be coming to the table and being fed by Eucharist. It might mean embracing the sacrament of reconciliation. It might be praying the Stations of the Cross. It may be utilizing a wonderful devotion like the Rosary. It might be in our Lenten practices praying, fasting, or giving alms to get us back on track. Sobriety, spirituality require change. So when we are on the spiritual path, what are we really doing? We're training our mind to do what? To take on the mind and the heart of Jesus. And when we take on the mind and the heart of Jesus, and we train our minds in such a way, it changes the physical brain. And when you change the brain, you change the game. And the game is our lives. You train the mind, you take on the mind and heart of Christ. It changes the physical brain, and the physical brain is what drives everything in the human person. You change the brain, you change the game. Sometimes when I talk to the professional community and they want to know about spirituality and this 12-step recovery, and I'm talking to physicians and nurses, I will say to them, this spiritual approach to life It's a systematic approach to change. So I'll say to the doctors and the nurses, it's a systematic approach to changing the neural landscape of the brain. And they're all like, oh, they love that. If I'm speaking to the clinical folks, counselors, psychologists, therapists, I'll talk in terms of the spiritual approach to life is a systematic approach to cognitive restructuring, emotional regulation, and behavior change. If I have the opportunity to talk to clergy, and they want to know about this 12-step recovery, I say 12-step recovery is a systematic approach to conversion and sanctification. And that's good words there, aren't they? When I speak to the recovering community, I say the spiritual approach to life is a systematic approach to coming home to oneself, coming home to God, and coming home to our brothers and sisters. Because addiction isolates and disconnects and disenfranchises and alienates those who suffer from it. What I'm really talking about to them is that this approach to life, it's a systematic approach to falling in love with God, self, and others. So the three that I want to focus on today is the systematic approach to cognitive restructuring, kind of changing how we think and our attitudes and perceptions, the systematic approach to behavior change, and the systematic approach to waking up spiritually. So the first, systematic approach to cognitive restructuring, taking on the mind of Christ. St. Paul makes it so clear. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. He also teaches us, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Direct your thinking. Take on the mind of Christ. Take on the heart of Christ and be as he was in the world. Train your mind to think like Christ thought. Train your heart to love as Christ loved. And it will change not only your brain, but your whole life. One of my favorite quotes from St. Paul in relation to taking on the mind and heart of Christ is from Galatians. And I'm just going to paraphrase it when he says, I live now, no, not I. Christ lives in me. Say that one time with me. I live now, no, not I. Christ lives in me. One more time, brothers and sisters. I live now, no, not I. Christ lives in me. So if you might hear me somewhere slip in the rest of my talk, I live now, you know what the response is, right? You know the rest of it. As I got sober and I learned the 12-step process, I was fascinated to find in the book Alcoholics Anonymous a passage that was so similar to the Oblate Directory. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the Oblate Directory is for us a roadmap on how to acquire virtue, to live the gospel, to take on the mind and the heart of Jesus. And I was reading it and I thought, oh my God, I know this. I've been living this or trying to live this since I took my first vows as an oblate of St. Francis de Sales. And I began to do a little research, and I began to realize where the commonality was. St. Francis de Sales, as we heard, was educated by the Jesuits. The spiritual director of the first recovering community people, actually the spiritual director of Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, was Father Edward Down, S.J. So I could see how the Jesuits influenced Francis de Sales' thought when he put together the directory, and I could see how in the early days of recovery in the 12 steps, how that same influence was happening. So if you could go on your program to page 22, I just want to read through with you the selection that I'm referring to. And for the oblates who are here, this will be familiar. On awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. We consider our plans for the day. Before we begin, we ask God to direct our thinking, asking that it be divorced from self-pity, dishonest, or self-seeking motives. Under these conditions, we can employ our mental faculties with assurance, for after all, God gave us brains to use. Our thought life will be placed on a much higher plane when our thinking is cleared of wrong motives. In thinking about our day, we may face indecision. We may not be able to determine which course to take. Here we ask God for inspiration, an intuitive thought, or a decision. We relax and take it easy. We don't struggle. We are often surprised how the right answers will come after we have tried this for a while. What used to be the hunch or the occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of the mind. Being still inexperienced and having made just conscious contact with God, it is probable that we are going to be inspired, not probable that we are going to be inspired all times. We might pray for this presumption in all sorts of absurd actions and ideas. Nevertheless, we find that our thinking will, as time passes, be more and more on the plane of inspiration. We come to rely upon it. We usually conclude the period of meditation with a prayer that we will be shown all through the day what our next step is to be, that we will be given whatever we need to take care of such problems. We ask especially for freedom from self-will and are careful to make no request for ourselves only. We may ask for ourselves, however, if others will be helped. We are careful never to pray for our own selfish ends. Many of us have wasted a lot of time doing that, and it doesn't work. You can easily see why. So this whole notion of beginning the day and directing one's thinking and previewing the day and preparing for the day ahead of us, to live in the moment, to live Jesus one day at a time, is right in the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous. So for the people that I work with, what I do is extrapolate it out of the text and I combine it with the teachings of our Oblate Directory, and I created something called Spiritual Points of Contact. How do you stay connected to God throughout the course of the day that you're living in? And I have to tell you, it goes over huge. As a matter of fact, we had a dinner in Washington, D.C. In mid-February, and a former patient who was there came up so excited to see me, and just wanted to tell me about something. I said, "Tell me, what's happening?" She says, "Do you remember that handout you gave us?" I said, "I give out a few handouts. Which one are you talking about?" She said, "The one where you kind of live a day at a time and stay connected." I said, "Oh yeah, the Spiritual Points of Contact handout." She said, "Yeah." She said, "You know what I did with that?" She said, "I laminated it. And I'm in a position now to help some other people, so I give out copies of it to as many people as I come across." And then she says, "And it's having a huge impact in their lives." Training the mind by restructuring our attitudes, our thoughts, our beliefs, our perceptions, and how we live in the day is not uniquely Salesian, but it is certainly a hallmark of our spirituality. So one of the things it says in AA is that if we do this long enough, that we will begin to live regularly in the plane of inspiration. Most of the oblates that I know are there. You know how I know they're there? Because of the feedback that we receive. You guys are phenomenal preachers. There's something special about you. And I think to myself, it's because of our spirituality. We live inspired lives. And we want others to live inspired. And it's so funny to me how in my own life, I never know where inspirations are going to come from. They come from all different places. And sometimes I think inspiration is almost like spiritual email from God. Like I'll be walking along or I'll be engaged in something and I got one of these, "You've got mail." I'm thinking, okay, what is it? And then some inspiration floods my spirit. Give you a clear example. Of all places, I was in my chiropractor's office. And he's going through this whole explanation of when your spine is in right alignment, all of your systems are working better because your nerves aren't pinched, and therefore you're not having impact in the different systems. It's fascinating because when I would go in to see him, he would evaluate me and he would say, "Any heartburn?" "How do you know that?" "You having any problem with congestion and nasal things?" "How do you know that?" He said, "Because those parts of your spine that are in control of those systems, the nerves, are being pinched because your spine has come out of alignment." Called it a subluxation. So what he would do is make an adjustment and get my spine back aligned. And I'm sitting there and he's explaining all this, and I get one of those, "You've got mail." And he looks at me and says, "What?" I said, "I just got an inspiration." He said, "Well, tell me." He was this pretty spiritual fellow. I said, "I think I just came up with the idea of spiritual chiropraxis." He said, "Tell me." I said, "Well, when the human will and God's will are in alignment, we know peace, we have some joy, we have strength and courage to get through the difficult and challenging times. When the human will and God's will are out of alignment, then chaos, turmoil, distress, the possibility of anxiety, depression, and the like. So spiritual chiropraxis is making an adjustment to get the human will and God's will back in alignment. And all of our devotional life and our ritual life and our sacraments are all examples of those kinds of adjustments. That make sense, anybody? Yeah. So you never know. You might be sitting here this morning and you might get you've got mail. So this whole notion of living a day at a time and creating spiritual points of contact, I'm just going to tell you the 5 things that I've drawn out of our Oblate Directory and share with people that might help them. The first one is I always encourage our folks, many of whom, when they're coming into recovery, have been completely disconnected from God, from faith, from the practice of religion, and are really seeking and searching because that thirst that they have, they were trying to quench it with spirits, and now I'm trying to introduce, no, quench it with the Spirit. And so what they come is in need of concrete tools. So for me, the Oblate Directory, 12-Step Recovery, it's a way to operationalize, to make concrete the spiritual life. So the first thing I teach them is, upon awakening, direct your thinking to God. And maybe it's a simple thing like this: God, help me not to drink or get high today. Or maybe it's, God, thank you for giving me another day. Or maybe it's, God, as in our Oblate tradition, I know that sleep is an image of death, and waking and rising is an image of resurrection. I rejoice with the thought that one day I may see you face to face. So whatever it is that we do, we start the day by directing our thinking. Otherwise, as I say to the people that I work with, you can wake up and your mind starts going. And here's kind of what might be happening in a treatment center. I can't believe I'm in this place. This is horrendous. I hate this place. My roommate snores like a bear. I bet they're going to have scrambled eggs again today. And a person's not even out of bed, and they're on that negative train. Right? So if we take responsibility for directing our thinking, taking on the mind of Christ, we can start our day in a much better frame of mind. Some of us may pray the Lord's Prayer, the Angelus, the prayer of St. Francis, whatever we do to direct our thinking. And then the second thing I teach them, which comes from our directory, is how do you prepare for the day? Kind of review your schedule in such a way that you might be able to see where some challenges might come and asking for the grace to meet those challenges, where some of the really wonderful blessings might be coming. And if you know that there's someone in your life that you have to experience today who pushes every one of your buttons, because that happens, right? Pray for the ability to be loving and patient and tolerant. And then what I always encourage them to do, and then preview your day. When are you going to make a 12-step meeting? When are you going to pray today? When are you going to do some step work? Are you calling your sponsor? Are you calling someone that you sponsor? So you're kind of preparing how I want my day to go. And to be open with, God, however this is going to unfold, I give that to you. But at least I'm prepared for the day. The next thing I encourage them is do a couple spot check inventories. And spot check inventory is language that comes from the recovery program. We know spot check inventories as examination of conscience. And so I always encourage folks, build it into your daily schedule. If you're a pretty routine person, you eat like lunch and dinner every day, do your midday examine right before lunch. Do your evening examine maybe before dinner or at the end of the day. And so ask yourself some questions. How is my heart towards all that's happened so far today? How have I connected with God? Or did I forget about God today and I need to connect with God now? Have I conducted myself today with dignity and grace? Or do I need to take a corrective measure because I acted really unprofessionally in a staff meeting? Or I said something really hurtful to someone and I know now I need to go back and to make that right. So kind of simple ways to just check in with our progress throughout the day. Spot check inventories. In our step work, we call it 4-step, 10-step, 11-step work that we do. Next thing I teach them is be intentional throughout the course of the day. And for the oblates, that simply means pray the direction of intention. It's what you heard Dave talk about earlier. Really simple. My God, I give you this action. Give me the grace to conduct myself during it in a manner pleasing to you. Right? Or if you like to shorten things, I like Father Mike Newman from the Toledo, Detroit province has a really good one. In the day of social media, he put together a direction of intention. It's almost like a tweet to God. Ready? Hashtag number 4, letter U, Lord. Hashtag for you, Lord. So a simple way of, before many actions, entering into those actions, just being intentional, having the mind and heart of Jesus as we go into whatever that action is. Whether it's cooking a meal, a board meeting, or taking a walk on a beautiful sun-filled day. Final thing, at the end of the day, review the day and find a reason to be grateful. I'll mention it in a moment or two, but gratitude is a really important state to live in. A lot of really wonderful research being done in the area of positive psychology that teaches how important gratitude is. So I encourage our folks, at the end of the day, just fill in this sentence. Thank you, God, for, and fill in the blank. Okay. So a simple way to train the mind, take on the mind and the heart of Christ, so that it can change our brain, and then hopefully change the game. Okay. Systematic approach to behavior change. St. Francis de Sales, in his unique wisdom, said this: when we are beset by any particular vice, it is well, as far as possible, to make the opposite virtue our special aim, and in turn, everything to that account. So doing, we shall overcome our enemy, and meanwhile make progress in all virtue. In the 12-step language, we have things that are called shortcomings, character defects. They're really another way of describing the 7 deadlies. Everybody remember the 7 deadlies from religious education? If you went and had any Baltimore Catechism influence on you, you know exactly what I'm referring to. So St. Francis de Sales and 12-step spirituality say exactly the same thing. In order to make progress, if something is besieging your spirit, practice the opposite virtue. Why is that important? The practice of virtue creates habit. Habit builds character. The practice of vice creates bad habits and destroys character. So we look always to practice the opposite virtue in our approach to change. So who knows? Somebody up front here, throw out one of the 7 deadlies. Anybody got one? Pride. And pride just happens to head the list, doesn't it? So the opposite of pride would be humility. And what does humility do? Helps us to see ourselves as we truly are. It helps us to relate to God in such a way that we understand God is God and we're not. It helps us to relate to our brothers and sisters. It helps us to keep an open mind and to be teachable throughout the course of our lives. So being transparent, authentic, and genuine, being ourselves, or as St. Francis de Sales would say, be who you are and be that well. Right? Humility helps us to do that. Another deadly. Who's got another one? Anger. Anger. So I heard a great line about anger. Anger blows out the candle of reason. Out it goes. And we're acting out of emotion. So if we practice the opposite, what are we practicing? Gentleness. Being gentle throughout the course of our lives and practicing that over and over again helps us so that when anger comes, which it will because it's natural, we learn how to do what? We learn how to react to it. We feel it within ourselves. We know what it is. We know how it feels in our body. And then we have a chance to reflect before we open our mouth and respond rather than reacting. Gentleness gives us the ability to feel it, to think about it, and then respond. And then what do? We learn how to process anger in a healthy way and let it go. I'm sure you know, as I know, some folks whose anger evolves into resentment. And then resentment's like a spiritual cancer that just keeps growing within them. And if any of us, hold on to a resentment, it's like harboring a thief in our heart that steals from us the capacity to take on the mind and the heart of Christ. People in recovery circles do a lot of work with resentment because it's a huge trigger to relapse. And one of our teachings is we are people who can't afford justifiable anger. Because if it becomes a resentment, we can easily drink or use drugs again. So if we want to cast that thief out of our hearts, we practice gentleness. And gentleness allows us to live in our intellectual self rather than reacting emotionally. Because you've met folks that are filled with it. You scratch the surface of some topic, and what happens? Out it comes. It's exhausting to carry all that. It's exhausting when you're around somebody that's what they express. Francis de Sales would teach us it doesn't have to be that way. Practice gentleness. Right? One of the other character defects, 7 deadlies, or another thing that I've heard them call index of maladjustment, is envy. And so the opposite of envy is charity. So we seek the good of others and rejoice in the blessings in their lives rather than being envious. I love the prayer that's attributed to St. Teresa of Calcutta. She would almost say just do the opposite. She says, people are often unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and sincere, people may deceive you. Be honest and sincere anyway. What you spend your years creating, others could destroy overnight. Create anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, some will be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good that you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway. In the final analysis, it was between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. So practice of envy, the opposite, charity, seeking the good in others. Greed, well, that's an easy one. Generosity. Living in such a way that we maintain solidarity with our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate. And I suspect in OLGC and St. John Newman, there are ample opportunities for the work of social ministry, reaching out to our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate than we are, and maintaining a sense of solidarity with them, right? Because it helps. Our generosity helps us to be less greedy. Lust, so the opposite is chastity. And chastity can have a multitude of meanings. One of the things that I like to teach about is it really can mean seeking goodness, truth, and beauty in healthy ways. The human spirit has a desire for the beautiful because beauty flows from God. I think that's why, for some folks, Eucharistic adoration can be something that's very powerful, because sitting in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament is opening one's mind and one's heart to the beauty of God. And so if we're practicing chastity and we're seeking beauty in healthy ways, we can open some doorways to the divine, things that are simple, appreciating the natural world, loving music, the visual arts, the creative arts, athleticism, and even a hunger and thirst for literature. Seeking beauty in healthy ways is living a chaste life, right? And it combats lust and opens the mind and the heart to taking on the mind and the heart of Christ. The final one, sloth, or a 5-syllable word for sloth, procrastination. Yeah, I'm hearing a little humor, so there may be a few. The opposite is zeal, firing one's imagination and being inspired. And the language of the imagination is different from ordinary language. It is symbol and sign, ritual, movement and gesture, silence, story, myth. So engaging in ways to be inspirational, right? Taking a walk in nature, learning a new language, visiting beautiful works of architecture, going to museums, being at a concert and letting it fill you up. Right? Can fire the imagination and break us out of inactivity that comes with sloth and procrastination. So as we change how we think, we change our behavior, we are open to taking on the mind and heart of Christ, changing our brain and changing the game. Or, as St. Paul would say, I live now. Oh, you're a little slow on the draw. I live now. So Salesian spirituality, 12-step recovery, as a systematic approach to awakening the spirit. St. Francis de Sales was one whose spirituality was filled with hope and optimism. When our lives are changed by the spiritual journey that we're on, we are open to the joy of living. We are open to experiencing freedom. For the person in recovery, it's freedom from the obsession and compulsion to drink and to drug. It's freedom from the stinking thinking that always leads to the drinking. It's freedom from all the chaos and the character traits that disrupt relationships. So you are in a position to be free to live again, to love again, and to laugh again. Or as I would suggest to you, to be in a position to take on the mind and the heart of Christ. I mentioned something about God's will. And St. Francis de Sales has many teachings about God's will. The will of God's good pleasure, God's permissive will, God's signified will, and how we live between them. And for me, I like to really just keep things simple. So God's signified will, the catechism. Right? Revealed truth that comes from scriptures and our teaching tradition. God's permissive will, life on life's terms. So a formula that I have figured out for myself and for the folks that I work with and offer to them is, if you want to follow God's will, here's a simple possible formula. Accept life on life's terms and align your thinking and your behavior with the gospel of Christ, and God's way will open up right in front of you, and all you have to do is follow it. Accepting life on life's terms, because sometimes life is challenging and difficult. Sometimes it's filled with blessing and it's beautiful. Accepting the good, the bad, and the ugly, life on life's terms, and aligning our thinking and our behavior with spiritual principles, with the gospel, with Salesian tenets, and God's pathway will open up right in front of you. Almost like the Yellow Brick Road in the story of The Wizard of Oz. Except we're not going to Oz, brothers and sisters. We're going to heaven. Because our life comes from God and we're on a journey back to God. I would suggest that if you have met we oblates and others who are trained in our tradition, as well as other spiritualities, folks who are on the path, who have a sense of joy, who live in optimism, who are free to live and to love and to laugh, they possess a certain quality to themselves. In recovery circles, we talk about seek out the people that have what you want. We call it attraction rather than promotion. Seek out the people who have what you want and ask them how they got it. And if you imitate it, you might find that you can obtain it for yourself. So those folks that have the joy of living, who have this sense about themselves, I like to call it spiritual swagger. Now, I'm not talking about ego or grandiosity or braggadocio or any of those things. I'm talking about what it's like to go through life with the mind and the heart of Christ and having your brain changed in such a way that you are available for love and service in ways that are quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. Salesian swagger is how I might frame it for today. And folks that are in possession of this wonderful quality, some certain things, their lives are rooted in gratitude. They have a deep sense of gratitude. And I mentioned positive psychology. The University of Pennsylvania is doing some really wonderful studies around gratitude. And you know what they say? People who are grateful have less depression, less anxiety, they're more productive in the workplace, they have more fruitful and healthy relationships, and they're much less likely to choose maladaptive behaviors. like drug and alcohol use, or like spending, or gambling, or spending and gambling's first cousin, shopping, or any of those other micro addictions that can happen. Rooted in gratitude. Second, they're steeped in humility. They have a true sense of who they are, and they understand themselves in relation to God, in relation to one another. It's really wonderful when we can see ourselves and imagine seeing ourselves as God sees us. I sometimes say to the folks that I work with, if there comes a day in your life when you see and love in yourself what God sees and loves in you, you will never have to take another drink or drug again. And that's truth. Right? So being steeped in humility. Clothed in love. Right? For one thing, I know that addiction destroys a human person's capacity for love. The process of recovery restores it. Salesian spirituality is all about love. Right? St. Francis de Sales, the doctor of love. Right? It's at the heart of everything that we do. Another Jesuit, and some of you may be very familiar with this, Pedro Arrupe, who I believe was their superior general at the time when he wrote this, and supposedly it was given to a group of religious women on retreat, but it's something that's really wonderful about love. He said, nothing is more practical than finding God. That is, than falling in love in an absolute final way. What you are in love with seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what will get you out of bed in the morning, what you do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, who you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love. Stay in love. And it will decide everything. Being clothed in love is a nice garment to wear. Last couple things, being guided by hope and filled with the light of grace. Hope draws us forward. I love Benedict's definition of hope. Hope is a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. Hope, when we have it, draws us out of darkness and into light. And finally, to be filled with the light of grace. I think often of the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, when he talked about being transformed, being an instrument of peace. And I saw a video once about a Harvard neuroscientist, Jill Bolte Taylor, who had a stroke. And the part of her brain that was affected was the part that took her personal identity away from her. She was still conscious, still upright, but she lost her identity. And that part, her own story, she kind of knew what was going on, but she couldn't connect. And when she had an operation to repair the aneurysm and the stroke that happened, she noticed something extraordinary. She began to read the energy of the people who came into the room. She couldn't communicate, but another part of her brain kicked in. And she knew the nurses and the doctors who had a real sense of compassion and love for her. She was able to read her energy, their energy. And one of the things that she talks about in a book that she wrote, Stroke of Genius, is how she learned how important it is to be responsible for the energy that you carry into the spaces of your life. In particular, the relationship space. So when we are filled with the light of goodness, with the light of God's grace, we carry ourselves differently. And then we become almost what St. Francis of Assisi prayed for. We become people who can transform the spaces in our lives. That where there is injury, we bring pardon. That where there is darkness, we bring light. That where there is sadness, we bring joy. That where there is despair, we bring hope. That where there's discord, we bring harmony. That where there's error, we bring truth. That where there's sadness, we bring joy. And where there is doubt, we bring faith. And we become people who now are not only responsible for the energy that we carry, but we become people who transform the relational spaces in our lives. Because we have taken on the mind and the heart of Christ, we have healthier brains, and the whole game of our life has changed. And with St. Paul, we say, I live, no longer I, Christ lives in me. So, if I were to sum everything up that I've been talking about, in terms of how you train the mind to change the brain, change the game, really comes down to two simple, really gospel realities. And that's to love and to serve. So people with swagger, when people ask them about what's happening in their lives, you know what I suggest that they say? I say, reach down inside of yourself and grab a hold of that energy, that Salesian swagger. And when somebody says, gosh, what's going on? You look so good, I haven't seen you. This is what's happening. You just grab a hold of that swagger, you lean back a little bit, you prop your shoulders up, and you say, it's all about love and service, baby. So here we are, on the verge of celebrating Eucharist, the love made manifest in our midst, and ready to go out and serve the world. I'm asking all of my brothers and sisters here at OLGC this morning, reach down inside. Get a hold of that swagger, that Salesian spirit. And when I ask you, what's it all about? I want you to give me something back with a little love. It's all about love and service, baby. And you don't have to worry, it'll just come up. All right? So here we are, my friends. I'm asking you, what's it all about? Oh, you're on the right track now. What's it all about? Oh, one more time. What's it all about? It's been a joy to be with you this morning.